What transforms a state's defenders into its executioners? Is it the will of one man, or the slow creeping rot within the state itself? The story of the 13th Legion is not merely a chronicle of war, it is an autopsy of a republic. And within its first 500 characters, a strange detail emerges from the annals of history. On the very day Caesar's legionaries stepped across the Rubicon, a little-known astronomer in Padua, Gaius Scribonius Curio, noted a faint, pulsating light near the constellation Aquila, the eagle. His records, dismissed as fantasy by his contemporaries, were ordered sealed by the Senate in the panicked days that followed. They feared not the stars, but what the people might read in them, an omen. This legion, forged in the frozen forests of Gaul, was not just an army. It was an organism of steel and sinew with one heart and one mind. Its heart was its Aquila, the eagle standard. Its mind was Gaius Julius Caesar. For nearly a decade it had been Rome's shield on the savage frontier, but shields can be turned into swords. The question is, who aims the first blow? The crucible that forged this weapon was Gaul, a sprawling, untamed land of 100 warring tribes, a place where civilization's veneer was thin and life was cheap. In the year 58 before the Common Era, when the 13th was first levied, it was a green unit, a collection of farmers, blacksmiths and stonemasons ripped from the Italian soil. They knew discipline, but they did not yet know war. Gaul would be their teacher, and its lessons were written in blood. Their first test was the Helvetii, a massive migration of an entire people, hundreds of thousands strong, searching for a new home. It was not a battle, but an extermination. The legion learned to build bridges under fire, to march 50 miles in a day, and to kill without hesitation. They learned that a wall of shields, the scutum, was more than wood and leather. It was a promise to the man standing next to you. And they learned that Caesar, their proconsul, was not like other generals. He did not command from a distant hill. He fought in the front ranks, his scarlet cloak a beacon in the chaos. He knew his centurions by name, and he shared his soldiers' meager rations. He was not just their commander, he was their comrade. This bond, stronger than any law passed in the distant Senate, was the first crack in the foundation of the Republic. Then came the Nervi, the bravest of all the Gauls. In a terrifying ambush in the dense forests of the Sabes River, they caught the Romans completely by surprise. The 13th was nearly annihilated, legionaries were fighting without helmets, centurions were being cut down, and the line was breaking. It was Caesar himself who grabbed a shield from a fallen soldier and plunged into the fray, rallying the men, his voice cutting through the din of battle. They saw his courage and they found their own. They held the line. They did not just survive, they prevailed. That day, the 13th was reborn. It was no longer a unit of conscripts, it was a band of brothers, baptized in the fire of near oblivion. Each victory hardened them. Each campaign sharpened their skills. They learned to build siege towers that scraped the sky and trenches that stretched for miles. They became engineers, architects of destruction. Their world shrank to the confines of the marching camp, a mobile city of leather and iron. Their law was the word of their commander. Their faith was in the eagle they swore to protect with their lives. The culmination of this brutal education was Alesia, a masterpiece of military engineering and sheer, bloody-minded determination. The Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix had united the tribes and holed up in the hilltop fortress of Alesia with 80,000 warriors. Caesar, with his much smaller army, did the unthinkable. He laid siege to the fortress, building a massive 11-mile wall of fortifications around it. But then a gargantuan Gallic relief army, 250,000 strong, arrived to besiege Caesar's besiegers. The Romans were trapped between two massive enemy forces. Any other general would have retreated. Caesar ordered his men to build a second wall facing outward. The legions were now caught in a donut of death, fighting a war on two fronts. For weeks the 13th and their comrades fought off relentless attacks from both sides. They were starving, exhausted, outnumbered 10-1. But they held. They were no longer just soldiers, they were a force of nature. When the final Gallic assault came, a desperate, howling wave of humanity, Caesar led a final, suicidal cavalry charge into their rear. The Gauls broke, Alesia fell. The war was won. The Senate in Rome debated laws, while the 13th Legion in Gaul wrote history with blood and steel. In those 8 years, the legionaries had marched thousands of miles, fought dozens of battles, and seen horrors that would break lesser men. They had grown old in Caesar's service. Their faces were scarred, their hands calloused, their eyes held the cold, hard glint of men who had stared into the abyss and not flinched. They were promised land, a pension, a peaceful retirement. But the whispers carried on the wind from Rome told a different story. They spoke of political enemies, of envy and fear. The senators, men who had grown soft in the marble halls of the Curia, looked at Caesar's legions not with pride, but with terror. They saw not a victorious general, but a potential king. And they saw in the 13th Legion not a shield for the Republic, but a sword aimed at its heart. The irony was savage. The very qualities that had made the Legion so effective in Gaul, its discipline, its cohesion, its absolute loyalty to its commander, were now seen as the greatest threat to Rome. What would you choose? Loyalty to a law that has forgotten you, or loyalty to the man who led you through hell and back? The soldiers of the 13th didn't have to debate philosophy, they lived the question every day. It was a choice between the abstract idea of Rome, a city of corrupt politicians and distant decrees, and the living reality of Caesar, the man who bled with them. Let us know your choice in the comments. The transition from the mud of Gaul to the marble of Rome was not a physical journey but a psychological one. While the legionaries spent their winters patching their gear and honing their skills in their camps along the Rhine, another war was being fought 700 miles to the south. This was a war of whispers, of backroom deals and poisoned words, waged in the corridors of the Senate. The hero of this war was not a general, but an idea, the Republic. And its self-proclaimed champion was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. He had once been Caesar's ally, his son-in-law. Now he was his most dangerous rival. Pompey, basking in the glow of his past triumphs in the East, had become the darling of the conservative faction of the Senate, the Optimates. They were old men, aristocrats who saw Caesar's popularity with the common people and his unbreakable bond with his army as a mortal threat to their ancient privileges. They feared that Caesar, the victorious proconsul, would return to Rome not as a servant of the state, but as its master. And so the political machinery of Rome began to grind against him. Laws were passed specifically to strip Caesar of his command. Messengers galloped between Rome and Gaul, carrying ultimatums and thinly veiled threats. The Senate demanded that Caesar disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand trial for alleged illegalities during his consulship years before. It was a political trap, and everyone knew it. To obey meant ruin and exile. To refuse meant civil war. The men of the 13th Legion, huddled around their campfires in Ravenna, listened to these rumors with a growing sense of dread and anger. They were simple men for the most part. They did not understand the labyrinthine complexities of Roman politics, but they understood betrayal. They had spent the better part of a decade fighting for the glory and security of Rome. They had conquered a territory larger than Italy itself. They had sent a river of gold and slaves back to the capital, enriching the very senators who now sought to destroy their commander. Their victories felt hollow, their sacrifices spat upon. The psychological pressure was immense. Every legionary had a family back in Italy. They were citizens of the Republic. The thought of raising their standards against the Senate, against Rome itself, was sacrilege. It was the ultimate crime, a violation of the most sacred oaths a soldier could swear. Yet what was the alternative? To abandon Caesar? To hand him over to his enemies, knowing that their own futures, their promised retirement lands, and their very honor were tied to his? The Republic to them was no longer the august institution their fathers had revered. It was a nest of vipers, a cabal of wealthy aristocrats who cared nothing for the common soldier. Caesar, on the other hand, was the man who had promoted them from the ranks, who had mourned their dead, and who had promised them a future. Could you raise a sword against your own home in the name of a justice you believed in? The question hung unspoken in the cold winter air. The choice was not between right and wrong, but between two different loyalties, two irreconcilable futures. This simmering tension created a strange, almost paranoid atmosphere in the legion's winter quarters. Every dispatch from Rome was dissected and debated. Every traveler was questioned for news. The legionaries began to see enemies not just across the Rhine, but in the heart of their own country. They started to refer to themselves not as soldiers of Rome, but as Caesar's men. It was a subtle but profound shift in identity. Their allegiance had narrowed, focusing from the sprawling, abstract concept of the state to the tangible, charismatic figure of their general. The Senate, in its arrogance, had failed to understand this transformation. They believed they were dealing with a rogue general. They were, in fact, dealing with a force they had unwittingly created, a professional, battle-hardened army that had its own culture, its own loyalties, and a deep-seated contempt for the politicians who presumed to command it from afar. A strange tale began to circulate among the troops, a myth about the legion's founding. It was said that the eagle of the 13th was forged from a thunderbolt hurled by Jupiter himself during a storm on the day the legion was mustered, a sign that it was destined for greatness beyond the will of mortal men. Such legends are born in times of uncertainty, a way for men to believe their cause is blessed by the gods. The Optimates in Rome, led by figures like Marcus Porcius Cato, a man of rigid and unforgiving principle, saw no room for compromise. To them, Caesar was a cancer on the Republic that had to be cut out. They pushed Pompey, who was perhaps more hesitant than his allies, into an intractable position. The Senate passed its final decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, effectively declaring martial law and branding Caesar and his legions as enemies of the state if he did not immediately relinquish his command. The decree was a death sentence in all but name. When the tribunes of the people, who supported Caesar and had vetoed the measure, fled Rome in fear for their lives and arrived at his camp, they provided him with the perfect justification. He could now claim he was not attacking Rome, but defending the sacred rights of its elected officials and the liberty of the Roman people against a tyrannical oligarchy. The stage was set. The actors knew their lines. All that remained was the crossing of a small, insignificant river in northern Italy, a stream whose name would echo through eternity. That river was the Rubicon. This was the invisible line that had been drawn, not on a map, but in the mind of every soldier. On one side lay their past, their duty, their oaths, their identity as Roman soldiers. On the other lay a future of uncertainty, of civil war, of treason. But it was also the side where their leader stood, the man who had never failed them. The Senate thought it was giving an order to a legion. In reality, it was asking a family to disown its patriarch. It underestimated the power of a loyalty forged not by law, but by shared hardship and mutual respect. The legionaries of the 13th were no longer fighting for Rome. They were preparing to fight for their Rome, a Rome embodied by Caesar. The clash was inevitable. The world held its breath, waiting for the first step, the first splash of water, the first trumpet call that would signal the death of an age. The premonition of war was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. The final pieces were falling into place for a tragedy of epic proportions, a conflict that would pit brother against brother and legion against legion. The great Roman civil war was about to begin, and the 13th Legion would be its terrible vanguard. The river itself was nothing remarkable. The Rubicon. In winter, it was a shallow, muddy stream, a minor geographical feature separating Caesar's province of Cisalpine Gaul from the Italian heartland. But law and tradition had made it a symbol. For a Roman general to lead his army across it was to declare war on the state. It was the ultimate transgression, a point of no return. On that fateful night in January of 49 before the Common Era, the 13th Legion stood on the northern bank, the firelight from their torches dancing on the water, glinting off their helmets and the polished eagle standard. The air was thick with tension. The soldiers stood in silence, waiting. They knew the significance of this moment. They were about to commit high treason. Their commander Caesar paced the bank, locked in thought. For hours he weighed the consequences, the incalculable cost of what he was about to do. Ancient historians say he turned to his closest officers and said, "We can still turn back. But once we cross that little bridge, everything will be decided by the sword." Then, as if seized by a sudden resolve, he strode towards the bridge, uttering the immortal words, "Alea iacta est." The die is cast. The sound of thousands of hobnailed sandals marching in perfect unison on the frozen ground was the only sound that broke the stillness of the night. The 13th Legion crossed the Rubicon. With that single act, they had set the world on fire. What followed was not a war, but a political and military hurricane. Caesar and his single legion did not march on Italy, they descended upon it. They moved with a speed that defied belief, a velocity born of years of campaigning in Gaul. They were a thunderbolt, and their target was Rome. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. Caesar had left the bulk of his army behind in Gaul. He was invading his homeland with fewer than 6,000 men, but he was not betting on military strength. He was betting on shock, on surprise, and on the psychological paralysis of his enemies. He was right. As the news of the crossing spread, it sent a wave of panic through the Italian peninsula. The optimates in Rome, who had been so bold in their rhetoric, were utterly unprepared for the reality of Caesar's response. City after city threw open its gates, not in resistance, but in welcome. Ariminum, Pisarum, Fanum, Ancona, they all fell without a single spear being thrown. The common people, who had long admired Caesar and resented the arrogance of the senatorial elite, hailed him as a liberator. His own soldiers showed remarkable discipline. There was no looting, no violence against civilians. This was not a barbarian invasion, it was a political statement. The 13th Legion was not just an army, it had become a weapon of propaganda. Their swift, orderly advance was a stark contrast to the chaos and fear gripping the capital. In Rome, the Senate was in a state of utter meltdown. The great Pompey, commander of vastly superior forces on paper, seemed to have lost his nerve. He had boasted that he had only to stamp his foot on the ground and legions would spring forth. Now his foot stamping produced nothing but dust. The senators who had clamored for war now clamored for an escape route. The panic was so complete that Pompey and the majority of the Senate made a stunning decision. They would abandon Rome. They fled the capital in a desperate, undignified scramble, heading south towards the port of Brundisium, hoping to cross the Adriatic Sea to Greece, where they could regroup and muster their legions in the east. They moved in such haste that they even failed to empty the state treasury, leaving behind a vast fortune that would soon fund Caesar's war effort. In a matter of weeks, a single legion had made its commander the master of all Italy. It was a blitzkrieg 2 millennia before the term was invented. The speed of the 13th was its greatest weapon. They marched through winter snows, covering distances that seemed impossible. They were a blur of motion, an elemental force that seemed to be everywhere at once. One of the legion's centurions, a veteran named Marcus Cassius Sceva, was famously quoted as saying, "We do not march. We are a plague, and Caesar is the wind that carries us." This phrase captured the essence of their campaign. They were an infection of rebellion spreading through the veins of the Republic, and there was no cure. The legionaries themselves were caught up in a strange euphoria. The fears of the Rubicon had been replaced by the intoxicating thrill of victory. They were no longer outlaws, they were conquerors. They saw the panicked flight of the powerful senators who had despised them, and it filled them with a sense of vindication. Their gamble had paid off. But this was only the beginning. Italy was won, but the war was far from over. Pompey still commanded immense resources, the loyalty of most of the Republic's legions, a vast fleet that controlled the seas, and the support of the eastern provinces. Caesar's lightning march had given him the heart of the Republic, but its limbs remained strong and defiant. After securing Rome and consolidating his political position, Caesar knew he could not rest. He had to hunt down Pompey's forces before they could unite against him. But instead of pursuing Pompey across the sea to Greece, he made a characteristically bold and unexpected move. He decided to turn west towards Hispania, modern-day Spain. Hispania had been Pompey's personal province for years. It was garrisoned by 7 of his most loyal and experienced legions, commanded by his trusted legates. It was the stronghold of his power base. Caesar's reasoning was simple and ruthless. I go to fight an army without a general, and will return to fight a general without an army. He would leave Italy in the hands of his allies and take his veterans, including the battle-hardened 13th, to eliminate the single greatest threat to his new regime. The Lightning War for Italy was over. Now a far more difficult and dangerous campaign was about to begin in the dusty plains of Hispania. The 13th had proven it could move with the speed of the wind. Now they would have to prove they could break a rock. The legion, having brought Rome to its knees, was now marching away from it towards a new and uncertain battlefield where they would face an enemy that was their equal in every way. The first act of the drama was over, but the bloodiest scenes were yet to be written. The dust of Italy had barely settled on their cloaks when the 13th Legion was on the march again. Hispania, a rugged, sun-baked land that had been a graveyard for Roman armies in the past. Here, there would be no cheering crowds or open gates. Here, they would face not panicked politicians, but 7 veteran Roman legions dug in and waiting for them. It was a gamble of colossal proportions. Caesar had left the charismatic Mark Antony in charge of Italy and set off to confront the heart of Pompey's military power. The campaign that followed, centered around the city of Ilerda, would not be a war of swift maneuvers, but a brutal, grinding duel of engineering, logistics, and psychological endurance. This was a war of spades and saws as much as swords and javelins. When Caesar's legions arrived, they found Pompey's army, commanded by the legates Afranius and Petreius, entrenched in a nearly impregnable position on a hill overlooking the Sicoris River. A direct assault would be suicide. The war began as an engineering contest. Caesar's men began to build their own fortified camp, and the 2 armies watched each other across the river like 2 scorpions in a bottle. The first crisis came swiftly. Spring floods, far more severe than usual, washed away the 2 bridges that served as Caesar's supply line. Suddenly, the 13th and their comrades were trapped, cut off from food and reinforcements. The vast Pompeian army on the hill looked down on them with contempt. Starvation began to set in. The price of grain in Caesar's camp skyrocketed to 50 denarii a bushel, an astronomical sum. The soldiers were reduced to eating roots and herbs. In Rome, news of Caesar's predicament caused panic. His enemies celebrated prematurely his downfall. For the first time since the darkest days in Gaul, the legionaries of the 13th felt the cold grip of despair. They had defied the Senate and conquered Italy, only to starve to death on a Spanish plain. It was here, on the brink of disaster, that the ingenuity forged in the Gallic Wars came to their rescue. The soldiers, remembering the light, hide-covered boats they had seen used by the Britons, began to construct similar vessels. Under the cover of darkness, they transported a contingent of men across the raging river, secured a hill, and built a new bridge in a matter of days. Their supply line was restored. The trap had been broken. With the immediate threat of starvation averted, Caesar turned the tables. His cavalry, composed of skilled Gallic and German horsemen, began to dominate the plains, cutting off the Pompeians from their own foragers. Now it was Afranius and Petreius who began to feel the pinch. The engineering war escalated. Caesar's men began a massive project to divert a part of the Sycharis River, creating fords that would allow their army to bypass the enemy's main bridge and trap them against the hills. It was a colossal undertaking, a testament to the legionaries' skill as laborers as much as fighters. The Pompeian commanders, seeing their position becoming untenable, decided to retreat towards the Ebro River, where they hoped to link up with reinforcements. What followed was not a battle, but a race. Caesar, famously declaring that our toil and our fighting must be for one and the same end, to get them to surrender, drove his men relentlessly. In a series of forced marches under a scorching sun, with little food or water, Caesar's legions shadowed and outmaneuvered the retreating Pompeians. The 13th, veterans of countless such marches in Gaul, set a grueling pace. Finally, Caesar managed to get his army ahead of the enemy, blocking their path to the Ebro. The Pompeians were trapped, cut off from water and any hope of escape. They were demoralized, exhausted, and thirsty. Yet they were still a powerful Roman army, and their commanders refused to surrender. In a remarkable display of psychological warfare, Caesar forbade his men from engaging in a full-scale battle. His legionaries, eager for a decisive fight, were enraged, but Caesar knew that a victory that cost thousands of Roman lives would be a hollow one. Instead, he simply tightened the noose. His soldiers began to fraternize with the enemy, calling out to old friends and comrades serving in the opposing legions. They shared their water and food, reminding them that they were all Romans, pawns in a conflict started by politicians. The morale of the Pompeian army collapsed. Their soldiers began to desert in droves. Finally, with their army melting away before their eyes, Afranius and Petreius had no choice but to surrender. Caesar had won a decisive victory without fighting a major battle. He had defeated 7 legions with minimal bloodshed. He was merciful in victory, demanding only that the enemy army be disbanded. The Hispanic trap had been sprung, but it was Pompey's army, not Caesar's, that was caught in it. The 13th Legion had been tested to its absolute limit, facing starvation, flood, and a powerful, entrenched enemy. They had survived through grit, ingenuity, and an unwavering belief in their commander. They had proven that they could win not just with the gladius, but with the shovel. It was a victory of will and engineering. But the war was far from over. This was just one front, one piece of the grand, bloody chessboard. Having secured the West, Caesar now had to face the man himself. Pompey the Great was waiting for him in Greece, where he had assembled a truly massive army and a fleet that ruled the waves. The easy victories were over. The true test, the clash of the Titans, was yet to come. The legionaries of the 13th, hardened by the siege of Ilerda, turned their faces eastward towards a showdown that would determine the fate of the Roman world. History offers us moments of impossible choice. Faced with starvation and certain defeat at Ilerda, Caesar's men could have surrendered or mutinied. Instead, they built boats from memory and dug canals in the dead of night. What do you think is a more powerful force in war, an army's raw strength or its unyielding ingenuity? Tell us your thoughts below, because the next battle would test both to their breaking point. The crossing from Italy to Greece was a masterpiece of audacity. Pompey's fleet, under the command of the arch-conservative Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, Caesar's old co-consul and bitter enemy, controlled the Adriatic Sea. They had hundreds of warships patrolling the coast, confident that Caesar's army was trapped in Italy for the winter. But Caesar would not wait. In the dead of winter, with a fraction of the transport ships he needed, he crammed 7 legions, including the 13th, aboard and set sail through stormy seas. He slipped through the blockade under the cover of darkness, landing his army on the shores of Epirus in a move that left Pompey and his commanders stunned. It was a brilliant success, but it had come at a terrible price. He had only been able to transport the soldiers, leaving behind the cavalry, the siege equipment, and most of the supplies. Worse, he had not been able to bring his entire army. The rest, under Mark Antony, was still stuck in Italy, with Bibulus's now alerted fleet making a second crossing almost impossible. Caesar's vanguard was now isolated in hostile territory, facing a vastly superior enemy army that was well supplied and rested. The campaign that unfolded around the coastal city of Dyrrhachium was the low point of Caesar's war. It was a story of starvation, desperation, and, for the first time, catastrophic defeat. Pompey, a cautious and skilled general, refused to be drawn into a pitched battle. He knew Caesar's legions were superior in a direct confrontation. Instead, he established a massive, heavily fortified camp on a peninsula near Dyrrhachium, supplied by his fleet from the sea. Caesar, despite being grotesquely outnumbered, Pompey had at least twice the infantry and 7 times the cavalry, did something that bordered on insanity. He decided to besiege Pompey's army. His men began constructing a colossal line of fortifications, a wall 15 miles long, intended to blockade Pompey's much larger force and cut them off from foraging on land. It was Alesia in reverse, but this time the enemy had total control of the sea and an unlimited supply line. It was a strategic blunder born of overconfidence. The months that followed were a living hell for the 13th and their comrades. While Pompey's men were well fed, Caesar's legionaries were starving. They were reduced to eating a type of bread made from a bitter root they called cara, which they would soak in milk. They hunted for any wild vegetables they could find. When Pompey's soldiers would taunt them about their hunger, they would throw their pathetic loaves over the walls, shouting that they would sooner eat the bark from trees than let Pompey escape. But bravado could not fill their stomachs. Disease and malnutrition thinned their ranks. Their strength waned. Still they toiled, building forts, digging trenches, and waiting for Antony to arrive with the rest of the army. Miraculously, Antony also managed to slip through the blockade, and the 2 halves of Caesar's army were reunited. But even with their combined forces, they were still outnumbered and in a precarious position. The breaking point came when 2 Gallic chieftains in Caesar's army, whom he had rewarded richly, were caught embezzling their troopers' pay. Fearing punishment, they deserted to Pompey, taking with them detailed knowledge of Caesar's fortifications, including their weakest points. Armed with this intelligence, Pompey launched a massive, coordinated attack. He landed troops by sea behind Caesar's lines while simultaneously launching a frontal assault from his camp. The attack hit a southern section of the wall held by the 9th Legion. They were overwhelmed. Panic spread like wildfire. Centurions were cut down trying to rally their men. The lines broke completely. For the first time in the Civil War, Caesar's legendary veterans were routed. They fled in disarray. Caesar himself rode into the fleeing mob, grabbing standards, trying to turn the men around, but it was useless. The rout was total. It was a disaster of the first magnitude. Thousands were killed. Several eagle standards were lost, the ultimate disgrace for a legion. The 13th, though not at the epicenter of the collapse, was caught up in the general retreat, forced to abandon the fortifications they had spent months building with their sweat and blood. In the aftermath, the mood in the camp was funereal. The invincibility of their army and of their commander had been shattered. Caesar, in his own writings, admitted that the war would have ended that day if Pompey had pressed his advantage. But Pompey, ever cautious, feared an ambush and halted the pursuit. This gave Caesar the breathing room he desperately needed. He addressed his shattered army, not with recriminations, but with a calm resolve that shamed them more than any punishment could have. He took responsibility for the strategic error, but reminded them of their past victories. The soldiers, filled with shame and a burning desire for redemption, demanded to be led back into battle. But Caesar knew they were in no shape to fight. Their morale was broken, their position untenable. He made the most difficult decision a general can make. He ordered a retreat. Under the cover of darkness, Caesar's beaten army slipped away, abandoning the siege and marching inland towards the plains of Thessaly. They were starving, defeated, and hunted. It seemed that the great gamble that began at the Rubicon had finally failed. The 13th Legion, for the first time in its memory, was on the run, its eagle tarnished, its future hanging by the thinnest of threads. Hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. The field at Pharsalus was a sea of shimmering steel under the hot Greek sun. Two Roman armies, the best the world had to offer, stood ready to annihilate one another. On one side stood Pompey the Great, with an army that outnumbered his opponent 2-1. He had over 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, drawn from the flower of the Roman aristocracy. They were confident, almost arrogant. The senators in his camp were already arguing over who would get Caesar's position as Pontifex Maximus. On the other side stood Caesar with a gaunt, weary army of 22,000 veterans. The men of the 13th Legion stood in the line, their faces grim. They remembered the humiliation of Dyrrhachium. They were hungry for vengeance. This was not just a battle for victory, it was a battle for redemption. The fate of the Roman world would be decided here, on this dusty plain, in a few short, bloody hours. Pompey's plan was simple and seemingly foolproof. He would use his overwhelming superiority in cavalry to smash Caesar's right flank, then roll up his entire line of infantry. It was a classic, textbook maneuver. Caesar anticipated it. He saw the mass of Pompeian cavalry, the sons of senators in their gleaming armor, ready for the charge. In response, he did something unexpected, a stroke of tactical genius that would define the battle. He took one cohort from the third line of each of his legions, creating a hidden fourth line of about 3,000 of his toughest, most experienced infantry. He positioned them at an angle behind his own small cavalry force and gave them specific, brutal instructions. Do not throw your javelins, use them as stabbing spears. Aim for the faces and eyes of the horsemen. It was a cruel, unorthodox tactic designed to counteract not just the horses, but the vanity of the young aristocrats riding them. The battle began with the thunderous roar of tens of thousands of men as the infantry lines advanced. Then, as planned, Pompey's cavalry surged forward, a magnificent, glittering wave of men and horses. They easily overwhelmed Caesar's small cavalry screen and began to wheel around to attack the flank of the legions. This was the decisive moment. As they charged, confident of victory, Caesar's hidden fourth line sprang from behind the main body of troops. They did not throw their pila. They advanced as a solid wall of spear points, a monstrous steel hedgehog. The Pompeian cavalry, unprepared for infantry that did not break, charged headlong into this forest of sharpened iron. The result was a horrific slaughter. Horses screamed and fell, impaling themselves. Riders were pulled down and butchered. The veterans of the 13th and their comrades stabbed upwards, aiming for the faces of the pretty young nobles who valued their looks more than their lives. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical damage. The elite cavalry, the pride of the Optimates army, broke and fled in utter panic, leaving the field entirely and abandoning the infantry to its fate. The rout of the cavalry exposed the now unprotected left flank of Pompey's legions. Caesar immediately ordered his third line, his reserves, into the fight, while his victorious fourth line wheeled and crashed into the enemy's exposed flank and rear. Pompey's legions, composed largely of less experienced troops, were now being attacked from the front and the side. The veterans of Caesar's army, sensing victory, surged forward with a savage roar. The 13th, fighting with a cold, disciplined fury, punched a hole in the opposing line. The battle dissolved from an orderly clash of formations into a chaotic, swirling melee of brutal, close-quarters killing. This was not a fight against Gauls or Germans. This was Romans killing Romans. Men recognized faces in the opposing ranks, neighbors from the same Italian town, even relatives. A dark aphorism circulated after the battle, attributed to a grizzled centurion. At Pharsalus, we did not kill enemies, we killed mirrors. It was the ultimate tragedy of the Civil War, a fratricidal bloodbath from which the Republic would never recover. Seeing his cavalry gone and his legions buckling, Pompey the Great seemed to suffer a complete mental collapse. He rode back to his camp, not to rally his men, but in a daze, as if he could not comprehend what was happening. He wandered into his tent and sat there, stunned into inaction as the sounds of slaughter grew louder. Caesar's men, relentless, stormed the Pompeian camp. The fighting continued amidst the luxurious tents of the senators who had prepared for a victory banquet. Instead, they met their end at the hands of the grim-faced veterans they had so disdained. The victory was total and catastrophic for the Republican cause. 15,000 of Pompey's soldiers were dead or wounded, and over 24,000 were taken prisoner. Caesar's losses were counted in the hundreds. As Caesar walked through the battlefield after the fighting had ceased, looking at the fields of Roman dead, he was said to have murmured, "They would have it so." It was a victory, but a grim one. The day the Republic died was not a day for celebration. Pompey, the great general, fled the scene in disguise, a fugitive whose power and prestige had been erased in a single afternoon. The 13th Legion had redeemed itself. At Pharsalus, they had not just won a battle, they had broken the back of the old order, but in doing so they had sealed its fate and their own. A new world was being born, and its midwife was the sword. The pursuit of a single, defeated man would now drag the 13th Legion across the Mediterranean into a land of ancient gods and labyrinthine politics. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with the young king, Ptolemy XIII, whose father he had once aided. He expected sanctuary. Instead, he found betrayal. The king's advisors, fearing Caesar's wrath more than they valued their old alliances, decided that a living Pompey was a liability. As the Roman general stepped off his ship onto Egyptian soil, he was stabbed to death by a former Roman officer in the king's service. His head was cut off and preserved as a gift for the victor. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later with a small force, including a detachment from the 13th, he was presented with the head of his rival. He was not pleased. The historian Plutarch says Caesar turned away in disgust and wept. It was one thing to defeat a rival on the battlefield. It was another to see a great Roman, a former consul and son-in-law, murdered so ignominiously by foreigners. This act of barbarism was the spark that ignited a new, bizarre, and dangerous chapter in the legion's odyssey. Caesar found himself trapped in a foreign capital, a city seething with intrigue and resentment. He had arrived with only 2 legions, a force of fewer than 4,000 men, expecting to accept a surrender and move on. Instead, he was drawn into a vicious civil war between the young King Ptolemy and his ambitious, charismatic older sister, Cleopatra. Caesar, in need of money to pay his troops and offended by the murder of Pompey, decided to intervene, citing Rome's role as the executor of the previous king's will. He took up residence in the royal palace and sided with Cleopatra, who famously had herself smuggled to him wrapped in a carpet. This decision enraged the king's army and the volatile populace of Alexandria. Suddenly, the great conqueror of Gaul and victor of Pharsalus was a prisoner, besieged in the royal quarter of Alexandria by a massive Egyptian army. The grand war for the soul of Rome was forgotten, replaced by desperate, dirty street fighting in the narrow alleys of a foreign city. For the veterans of the 13th, it was a surreal nightmare. They were masters of open-field battle, of sieges and fortifications. They were not trained for this kind of chaotic urban warfare. They fought on rooftops, in palace corridors, and along the great harbor. The enemy was everywhere. It was a war of ambushes and barricades. During one of the fiercest naval battles in the harbor, the great library of Alexandria, the repository of the ancient world's knowledge, caught fire. Scrolls containing priceless works of history, philosophy, and science turned to ash. The legionaries, fighting for their lives a few hundred yards away, were unwitting participants in one of history's greatest cultural catastrophes. A cynical quote from a legionary diary, likely apocryphal but capturing the mood, reads, "We came to Egypt to catch a Roman fox and found ourselves fighting Egyptian rats in a burning library." It was a war without glory, a confusing, claustrophobic struggle for survival in a land whose customs they did not understand. Caesar was in mortal danger. At one point, forced to swim for his life from a collapsing causeway, he supposedly held his sword in his teeth and his precious notebooks, the commentaries, above the water, with one hand. The legionaries, outnumbered and cut off from any hope of reinforcement, fought with the grim desperation of cornered animals. Their famous discipline and experience were what kept them alive. They fortified the palace complex, turning it into a fortress. They fought off amphibious assaults and broke through enemy blockades. They were no longer an army of conquest. They were a small island of Roman steel in a hostile Egyptian sea. The siege dragged on for months. It was a strange, feverish interlude in their long war, a bizarre side quest in their epic journey. The fate of the world had been decided at Pharsalus, yet here they were, bogged down in a squabble over an Egyptian throne. Relief finally came not from Rome, but from an allied army led by Mithridates of Pergamum, marching overland from Syria. With their arrival, Caesar was able to break out of the city and confront the Egyptian army in a decisive battle near the Nile. The Egyptian forces were crushed, and the young King Ptolemy drowned in the river while trying to escape. Cleopatra was installed as the Queen of Egypt, and her alliance with Caesar was sealed. The Alexandrian War was over. The 13th had survived, but it was a weary, depleted force that finally sailed from Egypt. They had gone there chasing the ghost of a dead rival and had been plunged into someone else's war. They had seen the burning of the world's greatest library and had fought for a foreign queen. The experience was both absurd and profoundly disillusioning. It was a stark reminder that victory does not always bring peace, but often just a different kind of war. The legion left Egypt behind, but the smoke of the burning library seemed to follow them, a symbol of the old world that was being destroyed to make way for the new. Caesar's affair with Cleopatra is one of history's most famous romances, but for the soldiers besieged in Alexandria, it was a deadly distraction. Do you believe a leader's personal passion should ever influence military strategy? Is it a dangerous liability or a source of unpredictable strength? Share your verdict in the comments. No sooner had the dust of Egypt settled than a new fire erupted in the east. While Caesar was entangled in Alexandria, Pharnaces II, son of the great Mithridates of Pontus, Rome's old and tenacious enemy, had seen an opportunity. He invaded Roman territory in Asia Minor, overran several provinces, and defeated a Roman army sent to stop him. He was attempting to rebuild his father's empire on the ashes of Rome's civil war. For Caesar, this was an intolerable challenge to his new authority. Leaving Cleopatra and a small garrison in Egypt, he set off with a portion of his army, including the battle-tested 13th Legion, to deal with this new threat. What followed was not a campaign, it was a thunderclap. The war against Pharnaces would become the ultimate demonstration of the speed, efficiency, and sheer destructive power of Caesar's veteran legions at the absolute peak of their ability. Caesar made a series of forced marches, gathering his forces as he moved through Syria and Anatolia. His reputation preceded him. Pharnaces, who had been arrogant in his victory over lesser Roman commanders, became unnerved by the approach of the victor of Pharsalus. He sent envoys to Caesar, attempting to negotiate, to stall for time. Caesar would have none of it. He continued his relentless advance. The legionaries of the 13th, weary from the fighting in Egypt, found a new energy. This was the kind of war they understood: a clear enemy, an open field, a decisive objective. It was a welcome relief from the chaotic street brawls of Alexandria. They moved with a purpose and speed that stunned their allies and terrified their enemies. This was the legion as a perfect war machine, a finely honed instrument of Caesar's will. The decisive confrontation took place near the town of Zela in modern-day Turkey. Pharnaces held a strong position on a hill with his army arrayed for battle. Caesar's army arrived after a long march and immediately began to entrench their camp on a facing hill. Pharnaces, in a moment of incredible foolishness and overconfidence, did something no sane commander would do. He ordered his army to advance up the steep hill to attack the Romans while they were still digging in. His own officers were aghast. It was a suicidal move. Caesar's veterans could scarcely believe their eyes. At first, they thought it was a joke. Caesar was famously calm, remarking on the enemy's folly. He quickly ordered his men to drop their shovels, grab their shields and javelins and form a line of battle. The Battle of Zela was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. Pharnaces' army, exhausted and disordered from charging uphill, crashed into the solid, unyielding wall of Roman shields. Caesar's legions stood their ground, absorbed the impact, and then launched a devastating counterattack. The 13th and their comrades surged forward, driving the enemy back down the slope. The fighting lasted only a few hours. What began as a battle quickly turned into a rout, and then a massacre. Pharnaces' army was completely annihilated. He himself managed to escape with a small contingent of cavalry, only to be killed shortly after in another conflict. The entire campaign, from Caesar's arrival in Asia to the final victory at Zela, had taken a mere 5 days. The victory was so swift, so absolute, so complete, that it inspired Caesar's most famous and laconic dispatch to the Senate in Rome. He sent a simple message: Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Those 3 words perfectly encapsulated the lethal efficiency of his army. They had become the embodiment of Roman power, a force that could be deployed anywhere in the known world to achieve a decisive result with maximum speed. There was no longer any question of who was the master of Rome. Pharsalus had broken the back of the Republic. Zela had demonstrated the terrifying power of the new order. A memorable saying became popular among the troops, a testament to their self-belief. The Senate writes decrees, Pompey builds walls, Caesar wins wars. This was the high watermark of the legion's glory, a moment of pure, unadulterated military perfection. But this perfection was a double-edged sword. The same speed and ruthlessness that made them so effective on the battlefield were hardening them, turning them into something more than just soldiers. They were becoming impatient with politics, with delays, with anything that stood in their way. Years of constant warfare had stripped away their civilian sensibilities. They were professional killers, loyal only to their general and to each other. This transformation would have dire consequences in the final, agonizing stages of the civil war. Having secured the East, Caesar now had to turn his attention to the last strongholds of Republican resistance. The remnants of Pompey's party, led by diehards like Cato the Younger and Metellus Scipio, had gathered a massive army in the province of Africa, and Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, were rallying forces in Hispania. The war was not over. The most savage and brutal fighting, the death throes of the Republic, were yet to come. The perfect war machine was about to be unleashed in a frenzy of destruction that would horrify even its creator. The final campaigns of the Civil War were not battles for victory, they were acts of extermination. The conflict had lost all semblance of a political struggle between competing visions for Rome. It had devolved into a blood feud, a desperate, no-quarter struggle between men who had nothing left to lose and an army that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. The new theatre of war was Africa, where the last of the great Republican leaders, Cato, Scipio, and King Juba of Numidia, a Roman ally, had amassed a formidable army complete with dozens of war elephants. They were determined to fight to the last man, to die for the Republic rather than submit to Caesar's rule. When Caesar landed in Africa with his legions, including the 13th, he found an enemy that was well prepared and fanatically motivated. The campaign was difficult, marked by skirmishes and supply problems. The final, decisive battle took place at Thapsus in April of 46, before the Common Era. The Battle of Thapsus was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Before the fighting even officially began, Caesar's veterans, tired of the long campaign and filled with a cold fury against the men they blamed for prolonging the war, lost control. Without waiting for orders, the right wing of the army, including elements of the 13th, spontaneously charged the enemy line. They were a torrent of pent-up rage. They brushed aside the enemy's war elephants, which panicked and trampled their own troops and smashed into the enemy legions. Caesar, seeing he could not stop them, spurred his horse forward and gave the signal for a general advance. What followed was a massacre. The Republican army was routed, but when their soldiers tried to surrender, Caesar's men refused to give them quarter. They cut them down where they stood, they stormed the enemy camp and killed everyone, including the non-combatants. Caesar rode among his men, begging them to stop, to spare their fellow Romans. But they would not listen. They were deafened by bloodlust. The spirit of Mars himself seemed to have possessed them. An estimated 10,000 Republicans were killed. Caesar lost fewer than 50 men. In the aftermath, the Republican leaders met their tragic ends. Scipio was killed in a naval battle. King Juba and a Roman general made a suicide pact, and Cato the Younger, the unyielding Stoic philosopher and symbol of Republican virtue, barricaded himself in the city of Utica. Refusing to live in a world ruled by Caesar, he committed a slow, deliberate, and gruesome suicide, disemboweling himself with his sword. His death marked the symbolic end of the Roman Republic. It was no longer a living political entity. It was an idea, a ghost that would haunt the future. The war, however, still was not over. The last bastion of resistance was Hispania, where Pompey's two sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, had raised a new army, composed of the remnants of their father's forces and native Spanish tribes. They waged a war of incredible brutality, executing Caesar's supporters and terrorizing the local population. It was a war of atrocities, a final, desperate spasm of violence. Caesar had to march to Hispania for the final confrontation. The battle that took place at Munda in March of 45 before the Common Era was the hardest, closest, and most desperate battle of his entire career. The Pompey brothers had positioned their army on a high hill, forcing Caesar's men to attack uphill. The fighting was savage, a hand-to-hand butchery with no room for clever tactics. For a long time, the outcome hung in the balance. Caesar's veterans, for the first time, began to give ground. The line wavered. The battle was on the verge of being lost. It was at this moment that Caesar, seeing the impending disaster, dismounted from his horse, grabbed a shield, and ran to the front lines. He shouted to his men that if they would not fight, they could leave him there to die. The sight of their 55-year-old commander, the master of the world, fighting like a common soldier, shamed and inspired them. They rallied. The 13th Legion, fighting at the very center of the line, held its ground and then began to push forward. The tide turned. After hours of horrific, close-quarters combat, the Pompeian line broke. The ensuing slaughter was immense. 30,000 men died at Munda. It was a victory, but a bitter, bloody one. Caesar later said that he had often fought for victory, but at Munda he had fought for his life. After the battle, there was no celebration. There was only the grim task of burying the dead. The Republic was not just dead, it had been dismembered, and the 13th Legion were the blood-soaked surgeons who had carved it up. The triumph that Caesar celebrated in Rome was for a victory not over Gauls or Pontic kings, but over fellow Romans. The spectacle was magnificent, but a dark cloud hung over it. The legionaries marched, their standards held high, but their eyes were old. They had seen too much, killed too many. They were rewarded with land and generous pensions, discharged from service to live as farmers and civilians. It was the end they had dreamed of for years. But could a man who had stormed the camp at Thapsus or fought in the meat grinder of Munda ever truly go back to tilling the soil? The war had corrupted everyone it touched. A legionary's dark joke from the time summed it up. We killed the Republic to save it from tyranny, and now we are ruled by the man we made a tyrant. The irony was as sharp as a gladius. They had followed their commander to the ends of the earth, had placed him on the pinnacle of power, and in doing so had destroyed the very world they had sworn to protect. They had won the war, but in a profound sense, everyone had lost. The final chapter of their story, however, was not yet written. The death of their commander was about to plunge the world back into chaos, and the veterans of the 13th would be called upon to fight one last time, not for a man, but for his legacy. The Ides of March, 44 BCE, a date that lives in infamy. On that day, Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator for life, master of the Roman world, was assassinated by a group of senators who called themselves the Liberators. They claimed to have killed a tyrant to restore the Republic. In reality, they had unleashed a new and even more terrible civil war. The news of Caesar's murder sent a shockwave through the Roman world. For the retired veterans of the 13th Legion, settled on their new farms across Italy, it was a personal catastrophe. Their patron, their commander, their source of security and prosperity, was gone. More than that, he had been murdered by the very aristocrats they had defeated on the battlefield. The old anger, the old resentments boiled to the surface. They did not see the assassins as liberators. They saw them as treacherous, ungrateful nobles who had murdered the father of his country. They strapped on their old armor, dug up the swords they had sworn they would never use again, and began to rally. The political landscape of Rome fractured. On one side were the assassins Brutus and Cassius, trying to rally support for their restored republic. On the other was Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and consul, who wanted to seize power for himself. And then a new, unexpected player emerged, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's teenaged grandnephew, whom Caesar had secretly adopted as his son and heir in his will. When Octavius, later known as Octavian, arrived in Rome, he was 18 years old, sickly, and had no political or military experience. He had nothing but a great name and a vast inheritance, but he was shrewd, calculating, and utterly ruthless. And he had one crucial advantage: he was Caesar's son. He began to use his inheritance to pay the legacies promised to the people of Rome and, more importantly, to Caesar's veterans. The soldiers of the 13th and other legions saw in this young man the heir to their murdered commander. They flocked to his banner, giving him the one thing he lacked: a private army of hardened, experienced veterans. The 13th Legion, or at least its veterans, was reborn. They became the backbone of Octavian's power. They were instrumental in the complex power struggles that followed. They fought for him at the Battle of Mutina, where they helped defeat Mark Antony's forces. Then, in a stunning political reversal, Octavian allied himself with Antony and another of Caesar's generals, Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate. Their stated goal was to hunt down and destroy Caesar's assassins. The veterans of the 13th, hungry for revenge, were their willing instruments. What followed was a brutal proscription, a wave of state-sanctioned murder in Rome that dwarfed anything that had come before. Hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy citizens were executed, their property confiscated to fund the new war. The legionaries, who had once shown discipline and mercy in their first march on Rome, now participated in a bloodbath. The final showdown against the liberators came at the Battle of Philippi in Greece in 42 BCE. It was a massive two-part battle, another fratricidal clash of Roman legions. On one side, the armies of Octavian and Antony; on the other, the last Republican army under Brutus and Cassius. The veterans of the 13th fought with a special ferocity. They were not just fighting for a political cause, they were avenging their murdered father figure. The battle was a bloody affair, but the triumvir's forces were victorious. Cassius and Brutus both committed suicide. The last hope of the old republic died with them on that Macedonian plain. The 13th had done it. They had avenged Caesar, they had secured his legacy, but in doing so they had handed the world to a new set of masters. The years that followed saw the triumvirate crumble and the final power struggle between Octavian and Mark Antony, who had allied himself with Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. The veterans of the 13th largely remained loyal to Octavian, the son of the divine Julius. They fought in his campaigns, helping him consolidate power in the West. Their final great service was likely at the Battle of Actium in 31, before the Common Era, the naval battle where Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant Marcus Agrippa, defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. With that victory, the civil wars that had plagued Rome for a generation were finally over. Octavian was the undisputed master of the Roman world. He would soon take the name Augustus and become the first Roman emperor. The Republic was dead, officially and forever. And what of the 13th Legion, the instrument that had made it all possible? Its time was over. The new empire, the new order, had no place for legions whose loyalty was personal, tied to the charisma of a single man. Augustus needed an army loyal not to a general, but to the state, and to him as the embodiment of that state. The old legions were reorganized, their numbers changed, their histories partially erased. The 13th was reconstituted given the cognomen Gemina, the twin, possibly because it was reinforced with elements of other legions and sent to guard the distant frontiers of the new empire. Its identity, forged in the crucible of Gaul and the civil wars, was subsumed into the vast, impersonal machinery of the imperial Roman army. It had destroyed the Republic to create an empire, and that empire, in turn, consumed it. The legend, born on the banks of the Rubicon, faded into the quiet routine of a garrison legion on a forgotten border. It had been the agent of monumental change, but like all such agents, it was ultimately a victim of the very change it had wrought. Its story is a timeless and chilling reminder that the path to order is often paved with blood, and the price of loyalty can be the very freedom you claim to be fighting for. The 13th Legion, fiercely loyal to its general, tore down a corrupt and failing republic. In its place, they cleared the way for an empire that brought centuries of peace and stability, but at the cost of political freedom. Now, as we observe the fractures and uncertainties in our own world, the question echoes through time. If you were forced to choose, what would you prefer for society's future? The volatile chaos that often accompanies absolute freedom, or the rigid order that comes with absolute authority? Write your choice in the comments, because history never truly ends. It just waits for us to make the same choices again.